As the panic threatened to engulf the entire nation, it became evident that the clearinghouses alone were not enough to stabilize the financial system. It was then that John Pierpont Morgan, the most respected and influential American financier of his time, stepped forward.
So he had a very unique role. His family legacy in banking went back several generations at that point. And he had played a leading role in saving the country and the financial system at other moments in time prior to 1907. So he was in a special position to exert influence. It's notable, however, that while famous, and of course we still know the name J.P. Morgan today, he was not the nation's or even the world's richest man. He was far outstripped by individuals like John D. Rockefeller and the like. It was the influence that he had on Wall Street and among banks outside the United States, Bank of England and elsewhere, where he had the respect and he had the insight and the ability to act quickly, such that he could corral leaders, heads of banks, heads of trust companies, to effectively impose or encourage, although in his case it was often impose, true collective action on their part, which was necessary because no one person could stop the bleeding, but acting collectively, and this would include the federal government as well, coming together to provide sources of liquidity when it was most needed at that moment when liquidity was clearly drying up.
On the morning of Sunday, October 20th, Morgan returned to New York City and convened meetings with heads of numerous New York City banks and trust companies. Their goal was to pool resources and coordinate efforts to prevent the collapse of the country's banking system and the stock market. One of the primary issues during the panic was a severe shortage of liquidity. Banks, swarmed by anxious depositors, were running out of cash and faced imminent collapse. Seeing the urgency of the situation, Morgan and his associates used their personal wealth and influence as well as banking reserves to inject much-needed liquidity into the banking system. They extended lines of credit and provided financial assistance to numerous banks that were on the brink of failure. In addition to his financial interventions, J.P. Morgan played a critical role in managing the crisis through effective public relations. Reporters quoted him saying, "As I've already said, I cannot too strongly emphasize the importance of people realizing that the greatest injury can be done to the present situation in thoughtless withdrawals of funds from banks and trust companies and to hoarding their cash in safe deposit vaults and elsewhere, thus withdrawing the supply of capital always needed in such emergencies as that which we have been confronted with during the past week." Morgan was not the only prominent figure in American finance who stepped forward to assuage the panic. John D. Rockefeller, the country's richest man at the time, put up $10 million of his own money. Earlier that year, President Roosevelt had appointed George B. Cuchelliu as Secretary of Treasury. His meteoric rise from personal assistant to assassinated President McKinley just 5 years earlier had shocked many. In just a matter of weeks, Cuchelliu managed to secure many tens of millions of dollars. With the raised capital in hand, he strategically injected funds to troubled banks around the country, easing bank runs and bolstering public confidence.
Secretary Cuchelliu, Treasury Secretary at the time under Teddy Roosevelt, had pulled together anywhere between $54 and $64 million in support for banks across the country, including $34 million that went directly to banks in New York City. So, while not the leading player, the federal government, through the Treasury, and again, remember, this is before the existence of any Federal Reserve. There was no lender of last resort. The only lenders of last resort you had were people like J.P. Morgan and the Treasury Secretary of the United States.
Ultimately, the decisive actions of J.P. Morgan and Secretary Cuchelliu during the Panic of 1907 were instrumental in stabilizing the financial system and preventing a complete collapse. The crisis highlighted the vulnerabilities of a lightly regulated financial system and sparked a national conversation about the role of government and the need for stronger oversight. After the panic, Heinze would be brought up on charges of 16 counts of financial malfeasance. Ultimately, though, he was completely exonerated in 1909 following a series of legal debacles in the courts. In November, he returned to Butte, Montana, where locals who had continued to follow his activities in New York through the news media viewed him as sort of a local hero. But despite being legally cleared of any wrongdoing, the events of October 1907 continued to have powerful repercussions on Heinze's life. He had seen his mining ventures collapse, his relationship with his brothers extinguished, his marriage end, and his health fall apart. He was described as distraught in appearance, and at the age of just 37, his hair was completely white. 7 years later, in 1914, he died at the age of 44 from cirrhosis of the liver. The Philadelphia Inquirer wrote, "His early death in comparative poverty illustrates how devious are the ways of the speculator and how dangerous is the game." Charles Morse was convicted in November of 1908 for violating federal banking laws. He was sentenced to 15 years in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, and while he initially remained free on appeal, by 1910 he had exhausted all options and was placed behind bars. In 1912, Morse became deathly ill. He was examined by a panel of army doctors who determined that he was suffering from Bright's disease and a number of other maladies. They warned that were he to remain in prison, he would soon die. With a number of influential figures of the time campaigning for his release, President Taft signed a pardon to allow him to receive treatment. But what the Justice Department would soon learn was that Morse had faked his illness, drinking soap suds and chemicals in order to manufacture his symptoms. Taft noted that the case shook his faith in expert examination. The Panic of 1907 cemented Secretary Curtelyou's support for the creation of a central banking system. He believed that the federal government had an essential role to play in safeguarding the nation's banking system, but was acutely aware of the fact that the Treasury Department lacked the power to maintain economic stability. Shortly after, Congress passed the Aldrich-Freeland Act, which established the National Monetary Commission, which studied domestic and European banking laws. Its assessments and recommendations became some of the founding principles behind the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. It wasn't discovered until several years after the panic, during what was known as the Pujo Committee hearings, that despite appearing to many as the White Knight, John Pierpont Morgan had used the banking crisis to acquire numerous banks and many of his leading competitors across a wide range of industries. Author and historian Richard Naclerio wrote, "While J.P. Morgan was ordering the public to keep cool heads, he and his Wall Street cohort were charging massive interest rates on their bailout loans. Morgan called the collateral on the loans he gave to his old adversary C.W. Morse. He used the collateralized bonds to acquire Morris's Consolidated Steamship Company, which was his competitor in that sector, as Morgan owned the International Mercantile Marine Company, the parent company of the famous Titanic White Star Lines. The Panic of 1907 was an anomaly. This dubious, unpredictable assault on New York City banks ended up becoming the catalyst for one of the largest cases of corporate consolidation in American history. The consolidation was so egregious that it was deemed a money trust by regulatory politicians. The Pujo Committee's report found that just 3 men, of which Morgan was included, controlled over $2.1 billion just through the resources of 7 banking institutions. But it didn't end there. The report also concluded that 341 officers of J.P. Morgan & Company also sat on the boards of directors of 112 corporations with a market capitalization of $22.5 billion. The total capitalization of the New York Stock Exchange was then estimated at $26.5 billion. In other words, Morgan had influence or outright control over so many corporations' boards of directors that they represented over 4/5 of the value of every corporation on the entire New York Stock Exchange. Despite the laundry list of antitrust violations, no one named in the Pujo Committee report was ever held accountable for their actions. Instead, the Pujo Committee's investigation prompted Congress to pass the Clayton Antitrust Act to ban interlocking directorships, the Federal Trade Commission Act to oversee economic competition, and the Federal Reserve Act to lessen the control of the money trust over the nation's money supply. Fast forward nearly a century, and the echoes of the past resonate in a different era. Lax regulation and reckless behavior once again prevailed, leading to another credit bubble that threatened to burst. Neuroscientist and financial theorist William Bernstein so succinctly wrote, "As the world grows wealthier and our financial system grows ever more complex, it outgrows the regulatory apparatus, which rather than adapting to the rapidly changing circumstances, becomes more hidebound." In 1907, the regulatory apparatus was the clearinghouse system of the so-called national banks, a relatively informal private network that provided temporary capital when needed to its well-behaved members. Trouble arose when a parallel banking system of trust banks, unconstrained by the reserve rules of the national system, began lending to increasingly speculative ventures. In 2007-2008, a nearly identical series of events played out as another parallel banking system, this time consisting of unregulated financial services companies, blew the largest credit bubble in the history of mankind. In the 2008 crash, years of prosperity and low interest rates had lenders seeing green, and lending standards were relaxed too far. High-risk homebuyers were given loans for vastly overpriced houses. When the housing markets cooled, many homeowners owed more than their home was worth.
When you think about a market becoming overheated, and we've seen that sort of bubble going back to tulip mania and the South Sea bubble, right? There's all this rhyming pattern to these bubbles. There's the left side of the bubble when things start from a very good place, right? And what the original idea was, let's empower people to be able to get into homes, which seems like I think it started from a very good place. But what the financial industry is really good at doing is taking a really good idea and then hammering it so heavily and for so long that it becomes a really bad idea. And the ripple effects, the unintended consequences become magnified. And that's when the bubble actually bursts and we sort of get to the right side of it. So people were empowered and encouraged even to take on way more housing debt than they could afford, right? All of that was going to continue to work, and it did for a long time, as long as housing prices continued to go higher. All it took was the beginning of that rotation lower. All of a sudden, things get a little more expensive. All of a sudden, housing prices start to rotate lower, and all these people are caught in mortgages that they could no longer afford. There was really nothing for them to do. There's no sort of release valve for that, except for things that come crashing down very quickly.
When the Fed raised interest rates, over 6 million American households could no longer afford their monthly payments and lost their homes to foreclosure. The default rate on subprime mortgages increased sharply, causing numerous bankruptcies at subprime lenders, and eventually bailouts for lenders whose economic footprint was so large that they were deemed too big to fail. If that wasn't enough, beneath the hood of the economic machine, banks, investment companies, hedge funds, and the like had been bundling up home loans into mortgage-backed securities, which were repackaged and sold to investors in exchange for high returns.
So a whole market came up for mortgage-backed securities, and basically, creating ways that those could be turned into, liquid products that banks and big institutional investors could trade in. And what happened were rating agencies were really probably not doing the due diligence to understand the specifics of the construction. Very few people actually went through how a lot of these MBS products were created, what all was included, what particular mortgages, the prepayment speeds, the delinquency, the default risk, all of that was underweighted. And so securities that, now looking back with perfect hindsight seem incredibly risky, at the time were given a stamp of approval. And I think that created this sort of feedback loop where the more products created more investment appetite. This is where banks were incredibly profitable, investors were actually making off very well, and as a result it kept proliferating. At one point the problem was the amount of derivatives based off of these underlying mortgages far outweighed the actual products, and so you have derivatives of derivatives of derivatives, and what felt like a house completely structurally sound built of bricks, it turns out was a house of cards. One of them comes off and the entire Jenga tower starts to come down, as a lot of investors, a lot of banks are tied up in these products that it turned out were way overvalued. And once they had to actually what's called mark to market, meaning actually admit to the broader market, here's what these are actually worth, it created a huge disaster, and again, took under some major banks in the process.
While the mortgage default rate rose and lenders were going bankrupt, financial institutions around the globe that traded heavily in mortgage-backed securities lost billions of dollars. Stock markets from New York to Shanghai plummeted. With financial Armageddon looming in the horizon, Congress was forced to sign off on a $700 billion Wall Street bailout as the country slipped into a deep recession.
But the reality is financial innovation in particular comes at a cost, and it's a cost of stability. The unfortunate reality for investors is usually there has to be some sort of crisis, some sort of pain point, and until the markets feel that pain, it's really difficult for regulators to be able to understand and really quantify the risks and appreciate them. So a lot of the most important regulations we've come under over the last 100+ years of market history have come after significant market dislocation, where there's been a bubble that has burst. And I think the way cryptocurrencies, as an example, improve from here and become more and more of a positive development in the industry is that balance between innovation, creating new products, and regulation, making sure that those products don't disrupt the normal functioning of the economy. And that balance is actually really difficult to strike.
Just as had happened 100 years earlier, prosperity led to greed, and greed led to risk-taking and malfeasance. When that was paired with relaxed, inadequate, or in some cases non-existent regulation, you had the perfect recipe for two of the worst and most far-reaching financial crises in history. The Panic of 1907 and the 2008 crash underscore the crucial importance of effective financial regulation and heeding the lessons of the past.